The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us for today's second session. The session earlier on today with Damien from the International Coach Federation was outstanding and very insightful. Lots of interesting research that's been done to coaching, and I know those of you that joined us very much appreciated that. Today, however, and this evening, we have a super session, one that you can get very excited about. We have joining us Daniel Pink. Now, before I do anything, I would like you to first raise your hands just to let me know that you can hear me loud and clear and that there's no technical problems. Okay, super. Thank you very much. Oh, hundreds of hands are going up. I'm going to put them back down. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so as always, we love feedback. We love interaction. So please post into the chat box on the right-hand side any questions, any comments, any feedback, anything at all. Please post in there, particularly as this is going to be a fairly interactive session. Daniel may have a chance to stop in the middle to answer some questions, so please put them there. Otherwise, we'll have some questions at the end, definitely. If by any reason you don't have any questions or anything answered, please jump onto our Facebook wall, facebook.com/WBECS, where you can join the conversation. There are thousands of coaches on there at the moment, highly engaged, and we are seeing hundreds of comments every day, which is super. It's one of the most active walls I think I've ever seen. So please get involved on there yourselves. And if you're on the Twitter sphere, the hashtag is WBECS, and we welcome your comments and your findings from this session. So anyway, without further ado, I'd like to hand over, or sorry, I should say introduce Daniel Pink. Now, Daniel is a best-selling author on the changing world of work and a number of other very hot, provocative books. He's got 5 very, very well-known books, including the long-running New York Times best-selling A Whole New Mind and Drive. His latest book, To Sell is Human. I highly recommend you get it. I've spoke to a number of executive coaches and business coaches who have bought it, who are blown away by it. It's a number 1 New York Times best-selling book, a number 1 Wall Street Journal best-selling business book, and a number 1 Washington Post nonfiction bestseller. Dan's books have been translated into 34 languages. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and their 3 children. Now, bear in mind that what you're going to learn today is also going to be something that's very valid for your clients. Now, don't worry, everyone. I know that I could see a stream of comments on the right-hand side saying that the screen is black. Don't worry, that's just the first slide. So, so fear not. Anyway, I'd like to hand over to my very good friend, Daniel Pink. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Ben. All right, so we'll get rid of this black screen here in a moment. So it's great to be with you. It's great to talk to coaches. I think the coaches do some really, really important work, really on the edge of a lot of what's happening in the economy. So what I'm going to do is talk about some research I've done recently that culminated in this book, To Sell is Human, that I think might be relevant for coaches. So one of the questions is, this is a book about sales, and this body of research is about sales. And so the question would be, are coaches in sales? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Coaches are in sales in 2 respects. Number 1, they are literally selling their services. But 2, I think that coaches are in sales in a broader sense, in that they're selling their clients on a set of ideas. They're selling their clients on a way to see the world. They're selling their clients on changing their behavior. So let's talk about sales in all of its dimensions. And let's start here with this first claim here. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. There are 2 ideas I want to give you at the outset to frame things. Like it or not, we're all in sales now. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you look at labor markets around the world, whether it's the UK, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, much of Western Europe, what you have here is something pretty interesting. You still have, in spite of all of the new technologies, in spite of all of the disintermediation of things that can be done by computers and the internet, you still have in these labor markets around the world about 1 in 10, 1 in 9 people who work in sales in all of these markets. It's pretty remarkable. Here in the United States, you've got about 15 million people. That's roughly 11, 12% of our workforce in sales. Their job is to sell stuff. They're selling tomatoes. They're selling consulting services. They're selling aircraft parts. They're in sales. But I think something else is going on, and I think it's incredibly important for coaches. And I think that for coaches, they're actually confronting this on both sides of the street. That I think the rest of us, including coaches, are in sales in a different sense. And let me tell you how I got this. I had a hunch that even people who aren't in sales are actually in sales. Now, hunches are good for some things. They're good ways to figure out what questions to ask, but I don't think you can go to the finish line with simply a hunch. So what I did in this body of research is I went out and did some survey research. Involving a survey of about 7,000 adult full-time workers in the United States. 7,000 adult full-time workers in the United States. We asked them a bunch of questions. I say we. I work with a data analytics company on this. We asked them a bunch of questions to try to get a more detailed, more textured, more nuanced sense of what people actually do all day at work. And so one of the questions we asked people was this question. I don't want that. Oh, I'm sorry. I do want that. Sorry about that, guys. One of the questions we asked people was, what portion of your time do you spend convincing or persuading people to give up something they have for something you can offer? What percentage of your time do you spend convincing or persuading people to give up something they have for something you can offer? Now, this is sort of like sales. That is, if I'm trying to sell Ben an automobile, he's going to get, and I succeed, he's going to give me a certain amount of money, I'm going to give him an automobile. And what I wanted to get a sense of was how much time people were spending on the job doing those kinds of transactions, though, with a twist. Those kinds of transactions, though, with a twist. And the twist is essentially this. I had a hunch that that's a lot of what people were doing on the job. They were persuading, influencing, convincing other people. They were doing the kind of exchange that is very sales-like, so that they would be selling a teammate on the idea of working for their project rather than another project. They would be trying to get their boss to give up resources for a project. They would be recruiting someone to come and work at their operation. They would be a boss, like the executives that many of you are coaching, trying to get their employees to do something different or do something in a different way. And what we got in the United States, and I think it's reasonably analogous, reasonably extendable, portable to the rest of the world, is that people were spending about 40% of their time, 40% of their time on the job, persuading, influencing, convincing other people. That's a lot of time. 40% of our time on the job is 24 minutes of every hour of every day. What I like to call non-sales selling. It's sales, but with a twist. You're selling, but money's not changing hands. You're selling, but the denomination isn't dollars or euros or pounds or pesos. It's time or effort or attention or energy or commitment. And so that leads us to the idea that, like it or not, we're all in sales now. Some of us are selling stuff, products and services. Some of us are actually, though, even if we're not selling anything explicitly in a product or a service for an exchange of money, we are spending an enormous amount of time on the job selling in that broader sense, persuading, convincing other people to make an exchange. And I think what's so interesting about this is how many, again, as I said before, how much coaches are actually working on both sides of this street. That is, they are in the persuasion, influence, convincing, selling business. They are selling their services explicitly, and they are selling their clients on the idea of changing their behavior in some way. And even more than that, they are actually doing things that can equip their clients with ways to get better at this. So, like it or not, we're all in sales now. And what I found, Ben, over the course of this research is that if I tell people, hey, even though if I tell people, surprise, you just won the lottery, they're pretty excited, they're pretty happy. If I tell people, hey, surprise, you're in sales, even if you're not in sales, they're less happy. A lot of people resist this idea. A lot of people have a very bad connotation about sales. And I wanted to get at that question too, that opinion, that belief, that frame of thinking. And so in this research, I also asked people this question here too. When you think of sales or selling, what's the first word that comes to mind? What's the first word that comes to mind? Now, this is an interesting way to do I think it's an interesting way to do survey research. It's a different way to get at sentiment. A lot of times with survey research, you can say to people, make a statement and say, do you strongly agree? Do you mostly agree? Are you neutral? Do you somewhat disagree? Do you mostly disagree? And you can gauge sentiment that way. And so what I wanted to do was get at this broader issue. I want to get a more visceral sense of why people didn't like sales. And so I asked people this question, and I got literally a text file of about 7,000 words. People's first instinct of what they thought about sales. I took out the nouns, things like marketing, persuasion, things that were essentially synonyms for sales or selling. And I focus on the adjectives. Why? Adjectives, with an adjective, you got to take a stand. You got to express your opinion. You got to offer your description. You got to have a point of view. And so I took the top 25 adjectives that people offered in response to this question. And I want to show you, and then I configured it into a word cloud. So take a look at this word cloud that shows the top 25 adjectives that people offered in response to this question. It's really quite remarkable if you look at that. The number one word by far was pushy. Number one word by far was pushy. There were other words, too, that were very negative in their sentiment. If you look at all these things in their totality, 20 of the words are negative, 5 of them are positive. So it's a 4-to-1 ratio of negative to positive sentiment. 4-to-1 ratio of negative to positive sentiment. That's really astonishingly high. You don't see any kind of profession with that sort of negative reputation. Almost no professions with that kind of negative reputation, especially if especially something that's so prominent in our economy and in our society. And so if you look at these words, they're also really intensely negative. I mean, you have some positive words there like necessary, essential, challenging, but you also have, such deeply negative words: sleazy, cheesy, aggressive. You even have interjections there, uck, yug, ick. And so this is something that we confront. So I think it's something that coaches confront, again, on these multiple levels that make them different from other kinds of endeavors. Multiple levels. So they have to confront it on the idea that, they might be resistant to selling their services. They might be resistant to trying to teach these sorts of skills to their clients and customers. And I think that this view of sales is incredibly outdated. That this view of sales is really a relic. It's very outdated. It really, to me, tells us more about the conditions in which sales have long taken place, rather than about the nature of sales itself. And I want to explain what I mean by that, because I think it's really important in overcoming this negative perception that most of us have about sales. Most of what we know about sales comes from a world of information asymmetry, where the seller always had more information than the buyer. When the seller has more information than the buyer, the seller can rip you off. And those were the conditions in most markets for a very, very, very long time. The seller had a huge information advantage over the buyer. When the seller has a huge information advantage over the buyer, the seller can take the low road. The seller can be dishonest, can be sleazy, can be aggressive, can be manipulative. And if you look at this, if you look at really until very, very recently, there was an incredible imbalance between sellers and buyers, not only on information, but just in their entire status. For instance, most of our experience as buyers until recently has been buyers don't have much information, don't have a lot of choices, and don't have a way to talk back. Okay, when buyers don't have many choices, don't have much information, and don't have a way to talk back, the seller can rip you off, the seller can take the low road. This is exactly why we have the principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware. The principle of caveat emptor, buyer beware, emerged because of information asymmetries. When the seller knows a lot more. When you don't have many choices or a way to talk back, you're on notice. You better be prepared to be ripped off. And I think this word cloud, let me go back to it because I think it's a glorious sight. This word cloud to me is really a word cloud, not about the act of sales itself, but about the conditions in which sales have long taken place, about the conditions of being a buyer in a world of information asymmetry. That's a world of caveat emptor. But in the last 10 years, something quite remarkable has happened. We've gone from a world of information asymmetry to one that is much closer to information parity, much closer to information parity. And you see this very much in, the sale of just about anything in any kind of market. You see this in the sale of automobiles. You go into a car dealer 20 years ago, and the car dealer is going to know a lot more about cars than you ever could, a lot more about that make and model and its pricing and its reliability than you ever could. That's a world of caveat emptor. But if you go into a car dealer today, it's a very different world. You can go in there knowing what all the local dealers charge for that car. You can go online and find all kinds of idiosyncratic information about that car that can aid in your negotiation. Here in the United States, I interviewed a car dealer in Washington, D.C., who said that when she first started selling cars in the mid-1980s, the factory invoice price of the car was locked in the safe. Even the car dealers the car salespeople weren't allowed to see it. Now, your grandmother can go into a car dealer with the factory invoice price of the car. So this is a really, really big deal. And it's made, again, going back to this information asymmetry that I'm picturing here. This information asymmetry, where the seller had a huge advantage, has flattened out. It's become less imbalanced, more of an equal relationship. So, in short, we've gone from a world where buyers have lots of information. We've gone from a world where buyers have not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back, to a world where they've got lots of information, lots of choices, and all kinds of ways to talk back. That is not a world of caveat. I mean, caveat emptor is still good advice, but that's a world of caveat venditor, of seller beware. That's a world of caveat venditor, seller beware. Now the sellers are on notice. And my argument here, and these two ideas that I want to leave you with, is that one, we're all in sales now, whether we like it or not, and two, we're selling in a world of caveat venditor. We're selling in a world of seller beware. And this is, I think, the conditions in which coaches are doing their work. These are the conditions in which coaches are advising their clients. And these are the conditions in which coaches' clients are navigating the world. So coaches, more than most people in the economy, as I said before, are confronting this at multiple levels. So if these two claims are right, we're all in sales, but we're selling in a world of caveat venditor, what do you do about it? What do you do about it? And so that's an important question. I want to give you some specific, clear answers on that. One way that I chose to answer that question is by looking at the social science. The social science gives us some clues about how to do this better. It turns out that in the United States and the rest of North America and Europe, most business schools don't teach sales. It's kind of remarkable. There are not that many scholars who study sales per se, but there are legions of scholars out there in social psychology, in economics, in behavioral economics, in linguistics, in cognitive science, that give us some clues about how to sell more effectively, whether we're selling our idea, whether we're selling ourselves, whether we're selling our services. How do we do that more effectively in a world of caveat venditor? And in looking at this research, I've come up with 3 foundational qualities that seem to be the most necessary in this remade landscape. And they are the new ABCs, attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. Attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. A, attunement, B, buoyancy, C, clarity. Well, let me describe each one, and then we'll turn the corner. I want to talk about attunement a little bit because I think it's really important for what coaches do and how they can do it better. And I also think, again, since coaches are really operating on both sides of the street, attunement is one of the, I think, really essential leadership skills that they can begin teaching their the folks whom they're coaching. So a 2 minute, a 2 minutes perspective taking. Can you get out of your own head and see things from the other side's perspective? Can you get out of your own frame of thinking and see the world through the eyes of others? A really important skill, very fundamental human quality. I'm going to talk more in depth about this in a moment. Let's talk about, so the second one is buoyancy. Buoyancy is a word that I got by interviewing a veteran salesman here in the States who said something really interesting. He said, the hardest part about being in sales, he said, is that every day I face, and this is his lovely phrase, an ocean of rejection. An ocean of rejection. It's a really poetic phrase. And that's, I think, one of the reasons many of us recoil from selling is that we get rejected. We get rejected a lot. And so buoyancy is how do you stay afloat in that ocean of rejection? And the social science gives us some clues about how to do that. What do you do before a sales call to be buoyant? It turns out that actually pumping yourself up with positive, affirmative self-talk is less effective than what scholars call interrogative self-talk, asking yourself questions. It turns out that there are some returns to positivity, a word that makes some of us roll our eyes, but the work of Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina shows some virtues in a positive affect. What do you do after an encounter? Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania has shown that one of the best predictors of sales success is how people explain failure, how they explain failure. And people who explain failure have a certain, people who explain failure in a way that is both accurate and not delusional, but also helps them stay buoyant for the next encounter, have a certain approach. They explain things, they look for ways to explain rejection and failure as not so much personal but somewhat external, not so much pervasive but somewhat occasional, not so much permanent but somewhat temporary. And so Seligman has some really outstanding research in that regard as well. And finally, there's clarity. And I think that at some level, people come to coaches for a sense of clarity. There's a welter of information and stimulus around them. They're having a hard time detecting what is signal and what is noise, and coaches can help them make sense of that. And I think that that broader ability is one of the most important abilities today. And at a more granular level, it means two things. One, we live in a world awash in information. So being able to access information doesn't give you much of an advantage. What gives you an advantage, because everybody can access information, what gives you an advantage is being able to curate information, distill information, take your expertise, apply it to the information, and make sense of it. It's a sense-making function right there. The second aspect of clarity is this, and I think, again, it goes really to the heart of what coaches do. If you're in sales, and your customer or your prospect knows precisely what its problem is, they can probably find the solution without you. They don't need you all that much. Where are you more valuable? You're much more valuable when they don't know what their problem is or they're wrong about their problem. And so the premium has shifted in some very interesting ways from the skill of problem solving to the skill of problem finding, from the skill of solving existing problems to the skill of identifying hidden and latent problems. And I think that's a lot of what coaches do. If your client or customer comes, if your coaching client comes to you and they know precisely what their problem is, you're not that useful to them. Where you're useful and where coaches are extraordinarily effective and useful is when clients come to them and don't know what their problem is or are wrong about their problem, and the coach is able to make sense of this welter of information and say, you know what, this is really what your problem is. Let's now look at some solutions. So, so those are the ABCs: A, attunement; B, buoyancy; C, clarity. Let me stop there for a moment, Ben, and see if there are any questions.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. There, I'm just going to go through. I think you're good, Daniel. You're good. You're good for now. If anyone's got any questions, please post them on the right-hand side. But Daniel, you're good as gold. The point you just made about about the fact that when coaches don't, or when clients don't know that their problem is, and helping them. I think that's a huge learning for everybody right now. But please carry on and elaborate from that. That'd be great.
Yeah, sure thing. So what I want to do now, Ben, is let me turn the corner a little bit because we're sort of, we're going from the more conceptual to the more kind of practical and tactical. So we're talking about here are the two ideas that I think should frame our discussion. I think it's really important. Again, I mean, forgive me for repeating myself, but I really, think that coaches are really on both sides of this kind of issue here. So I think it's important for coaches to recognize that they're in sales now and sales isn't what it used to be, but their clients are also in sales now and sales isn't what it used to be. And then I think it's important for coaches to, understand the ABCs of attunement, buoyancy, and clarity, but also to help their own customers and clients understand the ABCs as well. So let's talk about the ABCs here for a moment. And again, it's really rooted in the social science. So let's try. We'll do a sort of group virtual social science experiment here for a moment. Here's an interesting, and again, all of this is rooted in the social science, so let's explain a little bit about what social scientists actually do. And here's one kind of technique that they use in their research, and it goes like this, a very, very simple set of instructions. And those of you who are listening in can do it yourselves. Here's what it is. I'm going to give you 3 very simple instructions. Instruction 1, identify your dominant hand. Okay, so, are you right-handed or left-handed? 2, with your dominant hand, snap your fingers 5 times very quickly, okay? Finally, with your dominant hand, the forefinger of your dominant hand, on your forehead, write a capital E, okay? So I'll give you some time for people to do that. It's a little bit weird, but I'll explain this in a moment. So this is a test that social psychologists use to measure perspective taking. And they actually give people markers to do this. This is a test that's used to measure perspective taking. The idea, and here's how it works. You don't know what's being measured. That snap, snap, snap thing is a little bit of a distraction. You don't know what's being measured. So what is your default? What's your go-to move? Do you take your own perspective, as that example is on the left, or do you take someone else's perspective, the answer on the right? Is your instinct, your go-to move, your default? Is it to take someone else's perspective, or is it to take your own perspective? And what the research shows is that majority of people actually their default move is to take the other person's perspective. Not everybody does it, but it turns out this is very easily or somewhat easily manipulable. And let me give you an example of that. When you put people into an experimental setting and get them thinking about their own power, get them thinking about their own feelings of power, something really interesting happens. When people feel powerful, when they're primed to feel powerful, they become 3 times as likely to draw the E in the self-oriented way. That is, if you make people feel powerful, get them to think about power, they become more likely to draw the E the way I've drawn it there on the left, in the non-perspective taking way. Why is that? The reason these scholars say is that power leads individuals to anchor too heavily on their own vantage point, insufficiently adjusting to others' perspective. This is a really, really interesting piece of research, a body of research here, and what it says pretty clearly is this. There is essentially an inverse relationship between feelings of power and perspective taking. That is, the more powerful somebody feels, the more their perspective taking abilities degrade. I think that this finding alone is incredibly useful to coaches. Let's go back here for a second. I'm convinced that one reason why executives go awry, one reason why people quit jobs, one reason why their employees quit, is that these bosses, some of your clients, if you're a coach, draw the E the way that I've drawn it there on the left. Now, you don't want to spend all your time drawing the E the way I've drawn it on the right. You have to do more than take other people's perspectives. But if you're weak in taking people's perspectives, if it becomes something that you're not good at, something that is not part of your repertoire, you're going to not bring people along. You're going to be far less effective than you could be. And it's a cautionary tale for executives because of this finding about this inverse relationship between power and perspective taking. And this is true in any kind of transaction. If I'm feeling super powerful, I'm going to be less likely to take your perspective. Now, in a world where I have a lot more information than you, that's all right. I don't need to take your perspective. But in a world where you have lots of information, lots of choices, and lots of ways to talk back, that's going to reduce my effectiveness. So one of the key takeaways here, I want to give you guys 3 laws of attunement here, is that you can increase your effectiveness by reducing your feelings of power. And what I mean by that is this. Let's say that I have an employee named Jill. And I want Jill, I'm a boss, and I want Jill to do something different or do something in a different way. You know, I'm the boss. I can tell Jill what to do. And if Jill doesn't think it's a great idea, maybe she can make her case, but ultimately I'm the boss, so I tell Jill what to do. But if Jill is resistant to doing that, if Jill thinks it's a bad idea, Jill's probably not going to do it as robustly as she could. And so maybe I'm better off taking a page out of this research and understanding the inverse relationship between power and perspective taking and using this first law, that I can increase my effectiveness by reducing my feelings of power. So what would I do? Before I go into an encounter with Jill, all right, this is a selling encounter. I'm trying to sell Jill on the idea of doing something different or doing something in a different way. Before I go into my encounter with Jill, I basically try to remind myself that maybe I'm not as powerful as I think. Maybe at some level, Jill has the power in this relationship, because after all, my ability as a boss to carry out my goals depends very heavily on Jill doing something well. Maybe at some even deeper level, Jill needs our whole company a lot less than we need Jill. So what I do is recognizing this inverse relationship between power and perspective taking, I decrease my feelings of power, but I can increase my effectiveness, because by decreasing my feelings of power, I've increased my capacity to take her perspective. So I now can see the world a little bit better from Jill's perspective. Maybe I can identify some obstacle that's making her resist this thing. Maybe I can see there's a good reason that it's in Jill's interest to do this different thing in a different way. So one of the first things that comes out, I think one of the first practical tips in this research on attunement is this idea right here, that you can increase your effectiveness by reducing your feelings of power. And this capacity to take other people's perspective is so essential that we're going to have to get into the practice of putting ourselves in a mindset that allows us to see things more acutely from someone else's point of view. So let's go to the next one. Oops, sorry about that. Let me give you so that's one lesson. Imagine what the other side is thinking. Increase your power, increase your effectiveness by reducing your power. Let me give you another lesson here. I'll just go straight to a really interesting piece of research. It's a study of negotiators. And so they got a group of people to negotiate. There's a common set of facts that are used in negotiation studies. And these experimenters had 3 different groups of people who went into these negotiation sessions. One group was just given the facts and said, go negotiate a good deal. The second group that's our control group. The second group, they said, go into this negotiation and imagine what the other side is thinking. Imagine what the other side is thinking. Focus on their thoughts and their interests. Okay, so go in there, imagine what the other side is thinking. And the other group, the third group, they got a different set of instructions. They got the same facts, everybody got the same facts, and said, you go in there, but you focus on what the other side is feeling. Focus on their emotions, okay? So we've got a neutral group, control group. We've got a group that's focused on the other side's thoughts and interests, and we've got a group focused on the other side's feelings and emotions. Which group did the best? And I think a little bit to our surprise, given all we've read about emotional intelligence and given what I myself have written about empathy, the group that did the best were the thinkers. The thinkers did better than the feelers. Now, both the feelers did better than the neutral group, but the thinkers did a little bit better than the feelers. And so the second lesson here is when we think about perspective taking, don't think of it as a quote-unquote soft skill. I hate that phrase, but don't think of it as a quote-unquote soft skill. When we talk about perspective taking, we're not talking entirely about empathy and emotional intelligence. Now, ideally, you want to have both channels. You want to be able to process both channels, the emotions and feelings and the thoughts and interests. But, you know, life is hard. We have very heavy cognitive loads when we're dealing with real-time negotiation, real-time persuasion. We have to remember all of our agenda. We have to remember our facts and our arguments. We have to respond. And so, you know, there's a limited load that our brains can take. And so if you face that heavy load, and you have to triage between focusing on emotions and feelings and focusing on thoughts and interests. Focus on the thoughts and interests. The research shows pretty clearly that you should use your head as much as your heart. So, and I think it's a good tale for coaches, because I think that there's a perception out there that coaches are focused really on emotions, empathy, emotional intelligence. And I think that the really good coaches are really focused on their clients' thoughts and interests as well. Let's go to the third one. Okay, this is a really interesting one here. I'm going to give you the study here. So it's a study of, I'll go back here for a second. It's a study of negotiators, once again. And this time there are two groups of negotiators. One group goes in, they're our control group. The second group goes in, and just a few minutes before they are supposed to negotiate, they get some instructions, some last-minute instructions. And the last-minute instructions look like this. I'm going to put them up here in a moment. I retyped them because they're so crazy. Here's what the instructions say. Successful negotiators recommend that you should mimic the mannerisms of your negotiation partners to get a better deal. For example, when the other side rubs his or her face, you should too. If he leans back in or she leans back in the chair, you should too. But, you know, they say it's important that you mimic subtly enough that the other side doesn't notice what you are doing. Otherwise, this is going to backfire. Also, do not direct too much of your attention to the mimicking so you don't lose focus on the outcome of the negotiation. Thus, you should try to find a happy medium of consistent but subtle mimicking that does not disrupt your focus. Now, I think these instructions are pretty crappy. I think these instructions are so incoherent, they would have disrupted my focus. But essentially what they're telling people is, go into this negotiation and just be conscious of mimicry, of how the other side how the other side is behaving physically, how they're moving their body, what sorts of gestures they're using, what kind of posture they have as they sit in their chair. And to my amazement, that the group with these last-minute instructions to mimic did better. That is, negotiators who mimic their opponent's mannerisms were more likely to create a deal that benefited both parties. So this is really, really interesting. And I think especially coaches, and so many of them, I know some of your coaches are doing things by phone where there is some room for mimicry, but many of them are doing things that are in person. One of the things that is, I think, really helpful in moving other people, which is what we're talking about here, selling and non-sales selling is about moving other people, that you got to learn how to mimic strategically. And I think people have a little bit of a discomfort with this because mimicry has this very kind of duplicitous edge to it. We think of it as, oh, you're faking somebody out, you're hoodwinking them, you're being deceitful. And the truth is, human beings are natural mimickers. If you look at what you do, if you were to see a video of yourself with people you like, people you care about, you're going to find yourself mimicking their behavior, using the same expressions in some cases, sitting the same way, adopting the same kind of stance, using similar gestures and so forth. And so one of the things, especially in face-to-face encounters, is just being conscious of mimicry as a form of attunement. That when you actually start thinking about how the other side is physically behaving, how they're standing, how they're moving their hands, and you reflect that back a little bit, you actually understand their point of view a little bit better. And once again, this is another thing where coaches can use themselves and teach to their clients. And so those are the three laws of attunement that I think are really essential for coaches. Number one is that you can increase your effectiveness by reducing your feelings of power. Number two is that you should use your head as much as your heart, that perspective taking is very much a cognitive skill. It's about thoughts and interests, not only about emotions and feelings. And three, that human beings are natural mimickers, and so you should be conscious of that and try to add it to your repertoire. So let me give you some more takeaways here that I think are going to be really useful. And again, I think they're useful for coaches, and I think they're useful for coaches to tell to their clients and customers. So one of them is an exercise. I got two, I think, pretty interesting exercises. No, I have three. I have three, again, I want to be really practical and tactical here, give people some really actionable things. So those three rules are really actionable. Let me get even more granular with some of these more specific takeaways. One of the best attunement exercises I've heard comes from, it was actually started long ago by the the big American retailer Sears, the big, now crumbling American retailer Sears. But it's now practiced, I think most famously by Jeff Bezos, the guy who started Amazon.com. And what Bezos does, and others, is a little exercise I call pull up a chair. Pull up a chair, and here's what they do. When they have a meeting at their company, a big meeting, what they will do is they will have their software people, their marketing people, their operations people. But Bezos makes sure that around the table of this meeting, there's always one chair that remains empty. And that chair represents the most important person in the room who's not in the room, and that is the customer. And the idea here is that when you have an empty chair around the table, that forces everyone in the room to think about the customer. What would the customer think if he or she were sitting there? We're going to make a change in how we, in our operations. What would the customer think of this? We are going to alter our pricing. What would the customer think of this? We are going to alter the way that we onboard talent in our own operation. How would this affect the customer? And so this very simple exercise, just pulling up a chair, leaving it empty around the table to represent the customer, is a really, really powerful attunement exercise. And I think it's a kind of exercise that a lot of executives could really use and make them more effective. And it's a sort of technique that is, that coaches can really help spread. So I think it's a really, really great, useful attunement exercise for coaches at their clients. There's another really interesting exercise too, I think, that again, that coaches can both use and that they can then try to develop in their clients. And it involves something that I call social cartography. One of the things that's really interesting about effective salespeople is they have an uncanny ability, essentially, to make maps in their head. And by that I mean this: they can walk into a room. Let's say they're on a sales call at an early stage of a sales process. They can walk into a room, make a presentation, talk to people, answer some questions, and come out of the room with a pretty good sense of who's important, who's effective, who's influential, and who's not. So they'll come out of a room of 12 people and say, Fred and Bill absolutely don't get along. I don't want to get in the middle of this. James talks all the time but doesn't say anything. And Jessica is really the decision maker in this room. And it's a skill that I call social cartography. And I've been so impressed by it that I looked for a way to reverse engineer it and came up with something that I call an attunement map. And again, as you'll see, my theory of the case here for exercises and interventions, especially for busy people, are things that are cheap and actionable. Cheap and actionable. And so this is, again, like the pull up a chair, very cheap and very actionable. And so let me show you what I mean by that. So what you do is that you go to, this is a great way, go to a meeting, and at the meeting, when you're taking notes, just draw a little map and write down, I'll show you one here, write the initials of everybody at the meeting. Then, every time somebody speaks, draw an X next to their name. Every time somebody speaks to a particular person, draw an arrow from that person to the person at whom the comment was directed. Okay, so if you speak, you get an X. If you speak to a particular person, you draw an X from that person to the other person, et cetera, et cetera. And what you end up with in the course of a meeting is something that looks a little bit like this. Now, this is really interesting. This gives us a map of how this particular meeting went. And again, one meeting doesn't tell you a lot. You got to look for patterns. But if we can just suppose that this meeting represented a broader pattern, here's what we can see. Who would you think is the most influential person in this gathering? I think when you unpack it, my hunch is that the most influential person in this gathering is probably AB. Why? Because if you look at how many people are talking to AB, that's a lot of what's going on. People are talking to AB more than anything else. I think that JW, in the course of a meeting, we might think that JW is important. But what you find there, and again, you know, this is not a foolproof algorithm for divining these kinds of findings. If you look at JW, I think superficially in a meeting, people think, oh, wow, JW is really important. JW is really influential. And what you see there is all that happens is JW talks a lot. JW, and you've got a lot of people talking to AB. And so at some level, you know, AB might be the most influential person there. And this idea of social cartography and this particular exercise of drawing an attunement map is a very good way to get a read on attunement at a group level, attunement at a social level. And again, I like this exercise because it's revealing, it gives you a new way to look at social interactions, and it doesn't cost anything. You can just go ahead and do this if you have a piece of paper and a pen. So that's another attunement exercise. Let me give you one more. Let me give you guys one last exercise. And I like it because I think, again, it's really powerful and it illustrates, then we'll take some questions. The exercise is, the exercise is this. It's called it's a therapeutic technique that it will make sense here in a moment. And what it involves, this particular technique involves asking people two irrational questions. And I think this is a really, really interesting technique for coaches themselves. You can go in and ask people two irrational questions. So let's say that you want to get somebody to do something. So let's say that I'm trying to convince an employee that let me think here. A good example. I'm trying to convince an employee that he should pay more attention to. He's a technical expert, but he needs to pay more attention to being a little bit kinder and gentler to people, a little bit less abrupt, a little bit less short with people. Okay. And this person isn't that keen on the idea. He thinks that, well, that's stupid. That's this idea, even though it's pretty clear that if he had a little bit better bedside manner, he'd be a much more effective contributor. And so what you can do with somebody like that is ask two irrational questions, okay? And here's how it goes. The first question you can ask, so we'll call that person Bill. All right, so you want Bill to have a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more empathetic, a little bit better bedside manner inside of the company. He's in IT, and he's good at the technical side of his job, but people aren't actually doing a lot of what he wants them to do because he's too brusque with them. So we go to Bill, and we ask him two irrational questions. Question one, Bill, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to start trying to have a little bit of a better bedside manner, being a little bit more empathetic with people? Now, Bill doesn't think this is a great idea. So let's say that Bill says it's a 2 or a 3. Let's say it's a 2. I'm a 2, okay? Here's where it gets interesting. The follow-up question, the second irrational question, is this right here. He says, I'm a 2. So you say, why didn't you pick a lower number? Why didn't you pick a lower number? All right, now this actually always throws people. This really throws people. And what happens there is that Bill has to begin explaining why he's not a 1. Why aren't you a 1? What happens is that Bill starts describing why he's a 2 and not a 1. Well, you know, I probably should. It'd probably be a little bit more effective if I had a little bit better bedside manner. I probably would save some time because I wouldn't have to repeat instructions all the time. I don't know, maybe I'd be a little bit happier if I were, you know, people would treat me a little bit better. And what happens there is that Bill, and this is really the thing that I want to leave you with here. It's true in motivation, it's true in persuasion, it's own reasons for doing something. They believe those reasons more deeply and adhere to them more strongly. And so motivation, influence, is not manipulating certain levers in people, but really trying to create a context where people have their own reasons for doing something, when people have their own autonomous, intrinsically motivated reasons for doing something. And this is one reason why this particular technique, on a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to do this? They give you a 2 or a 3, and you say, why isn't it a lower number? They have to begin articulating those reasons. So one of the things I want to leave you with, again, is this very idea. As Edward Deci, one of the great leaders of, one of the great scholars in motivation, has said, motivation is not something that one person does to another. It's something that people do for themselves. And I think that's really the essence of coaching, is how do you put people in positions, how do you frame issues, how do you sell people on the idea of looking at things in a new way, and as a consequence of that, they're able to summon their own autonomous, intrinsically motivated reasons for carrying out certain behavior. So on that, Ben, let me stop and let's take some questions.
Thank you very much for that, Daniel. If you have any questions, please post them in the right-hand side. I know right at the last, about 3 or 4 minutes, we had a bit of sound popping in and out, but hopefully it didn't distress you too much. I know it's just a few words that we missed there. But, okay, the first question, going back to buoyancy and the fact that, is it possible, and is there a way that you can amplify the buoyancy?
Absolutely. Good question. Let me explain how to do. Let me give you some tips on that. So, I think the best thing is at the University of Pennsylvania, really the leading light in the entire field of.
Daniel,
Daniel,
yes. Just sorry to cut in. We're losing you quite a lot. I'm not sure if there's any way that we can. The sound keeps cutting out.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, can you hear me okay now?
I can now. Yes, you're coming in now. If it's too much, I will let you know.
Okay, yeah, just interrupt me and let me know, and I can repeat it. Okay. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
So anyway, so I was talking about Martin Seligman. He's one of the lead. He's really the founder of the whole idea of positive psychology, and what some of his research several years ago involved insurance sales men. They're almost always men, and what he found was that is that how, as I mentioned before, how he explained failure was an incredible predictor of whether they were able to remain buoyant. And what he said is that, really to the question, which is that you can learn how to do this. And Seligman's work is very interesting. He started out studying what's called learned helplessness. He was one of the people who just basically came up with that idea of learned helplessness, that sometimes animals and then people can feel helpless, even though they're not helpless. They learn how to be helpless. And he translated that, he sort of extended that to the idea of learned optimism, that people can learn how to be optimistic. And there's some specific things that you can do. And what Seligman has, is what he calls the 3 Ps, permanent, pervasive, and personal. Permanent, pervasive, and personal. And so there are 3 very distinct questions you can ask yourself after something that didn't go right. So you make a mistake, you get rejected. Here are 3 questions you can ask yourself. The first question is, is this permanent? Okay, question 1, is this permanent? And if the answer is, yes, I've completely lost all of my skill, I'm no good at coaching, I'm no good at selling, and this is going to ruin everything, that's not a great response, although that's a response that a lot of us have. The better response today is, no, this is just temporary. The market's not great right now. I was a little bit flat today, and that's how it goes. So you look for ways to explain things that's not permanent but temporary. Okay? Second thing, is this pervasive? And we have a tendency to say, oh, this always happens, all right? Everybody in this industry is an idiot. I can't deal with these people. This is always the way it is here. And that's usually not the case, okay? It's probably occasional. Maybe this particular guy across the table was a jerk. Go back and think about some other kind of a time when you actually made the sale, when you actually accomplished what you set out to accomplish. And then finally is this personal? And you say, well, it's entirely my fault. The reason that I didn't make this sale, the reason that I didn't get this client is that it's entirely my fault. And you know what? That's often not the case. Maybe you could have done a better job, but part of the reason might be that this client wasn't ready to buy right now. This client had a brother-in-law who was also in this business and is sort of forced to take that vendor. And so if you go to these 3 Ps, is it permanent? No, it's probably temporary. Is it pervasive? No, it's probably occasional. Is it entirely personal? No, it's at least partly external. Though that kind of almost algorithmic approach can really leave you buoyant. And there's a really lovely word that a lot of these scholars use to describe this, because failure rejection feels so much like a catastrophe to us. We hate it so much. They say, look for ways to decatastrophize those failures. And we have a tendency to catastrophize, to make them seem like catastrophes, to say, it's all my fault, it always happened, and it's going to ruin everything. And you have to look for ways, this very systematic way, to re-explain the failure, and that can leave you much more buoyant for the next encounter.
Thank you very much for Dan. When you were talking about the third exercise, which is the 2 irrational questions, would you be able to just very briefly go over that in summary? Because I know a lot of coaches were following that intently, as I was, but you were just dropping in and out.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, no problem. Let's do this. It's a really important point. So let's do it again. So there are 2. So this is It's a technique for motivational interviewing. It's a technique for motivational interviewing, and it involves asking these 2 questions that seem to be irrational. The first, so you're trying to get somebody to do something. I don't know if you want to give me a scenario where you're trying to get somebody to do to do a particular thing. You're trying to. You have an example you want to use?
Okay, an example could be you're trying to get someone to not be taking so much time off work.
Okay, great one. Okay, so you're trying to, so you got someone you have a pretty flexible leave policy at your office, but you have someone who seems to be doing a little bit too much, okay? So how do you get someone to stop doing this? Now, the typical ways, what you could do is, which is a bad idea, is, let's change the policy for everybody. Let's have a much more rigid policy. That's a bad idea because it's going to disadvantage a lot of other people. You could coerce that person. You could say, hey, you got to stop it. You're out of line. And, then the person might come in a more compliant way, which isn't necessarily the great thing. Or you could do these 2 irrational questions, okay? And so here's the first question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to come into the office a little more often? A scale of 1 to 10, how ready are you to come into the office a little bit more often? Now, this person, doesn't like coming into the office that much. They're obviously not doing it, so they're not that ready to do this. So maybe let's say they're a 3. They say, you know what, I'm a 3. I'm just not that ready to come into the office that much. Okay? They're a 3 on a scale of 10. They're not very high. They're not very ready to do this. Here's where it gets interesting. You do the follow-up question, which is this. The follow-up question is, why didn't you pick a lower number? Okay? That always freaks people out. Why didn't you pick a lower number? And the reason that freaks people out a little bit is that they're not expecting that question. And so what happens there is that what they have to do is they have to, in some sense, defend their position. They have to say, well, let's just make it explicit. That person has to say, let's play it out. That person says, well, I probably should come into the office more because it's not really fair to my colleagues that I'm not around as much as I should be, and even though we have this flexible policy, Maybe they think I'm not being fair to them. The reason I'm not a 2 and I'm a 3 is that you know, I probably would be a little bit better at my own work if I were to come in a little bit more often. The reason I'm not a 2 and I'm a 3 is that, you know, maybe I would enjoy my job a little bit more if I saw people, if I came in a little bit more often. Maybe I would be a little bit more, I would find things a little bit more. I'm a little bit isolated not being in the office all the time. So what you're doing there is you are essentially, what you're doing is that person is basically coming up with his own reasons for doing something. And that's really the key. So you say, on a scale of 0 to 10, 1 to 10, how ready are you to do this? People aren't ready to do this because they're not doing it. So they say a 3 or a whatever, and you say, why isn't it a lower number? They have to explain why they're not a 2, because in most cases of resisting behavior, people have some modest willingness to do it. They know that they should do it at some level. At some level, they want to do it. And so the key here in this technique of motivational interviewing, especially that follow-up question, why didn't you pick a lower number, is that they begin articulating their own reasons for doing something. So when I would say to this guy, he's coming up with his own reasons for doing something. Well, you know, I probably would want to come into the office more because my colleagues would think it's more fair. I probably would want to come into the office more because I might enjoy it a little bit more. I might want to come into the office more and it actually might even make me enjoy my job a little bit more. And the key thing here is that when people have their own reasons for doing something, they are more likely to do it. When you have your own reasons for doing something, they're more likely, when you have your own reasons for doing something, or believing something, you believe those reasons more deeply, you adhere to those beliefs more strongly, you're more likely to carry out the behavior. This is really, really essential. And I think, as I was saying before, and I hope it's not too repetitive, is that this is really at the heart of coaching. That is, coaching isn't about, I mean, I quoted Edward Deci, the great scholar of motivation, who said, who told us motivation isn't something that one person does to another. It's actually something that people do for themselves. And I think that's the way we have to think of it. It's the way we have to think about persuasion and influence too. That people are more likely to do something in an effective, enduring, engaged way when they have not your reasons for doing something, not your reasons for believing something, but their own autonomous, intrinsically motivated reasons, their own reasons for doing something and believing in things. And I think that really the secret of coaching is not how do you manipulate levers to try to change behavior in a more mechanical, robotic way, but how do you set the context where people can summon their own, again, autonomous, intrinsically motivated reasons for doing something.
Just one quick question, which a lot of coaches have asked, Daniel, is what happens if someone picks a number 1 or 0?
Great question. I'm so glad. You know what? I should have mentioned that. It's an excellent question. I'm so glad that you asked that. Well, here's what happens. Very rarely do people in the course it's offer a 1. Okay, so almost always you get like a 2, a 3, or a 4. You never get 5 or above, and you rarely get 1. But that's a really good question. If someone says, if someone says I'm a 1, all right, the response to that, I'm so glad you guys asked that because I spaced on this. The response to that is, what can we do to make it a 2? What can we do to make it a 2? So in the case, Ben, that you just gave, if he says I'm a 1, what can we do to make it a 2? Maybe what it means is like, you know what, I'd rather have you could give me a desk on a different floor, not on this floor, because I don't get along with the people on that floor. Maybe it could be, you could give me a little bit less work, so I'm not constantly crashing late at night to try to fulfill all my assignments. And so what that does is that suggests that's a way for him or her to begin saying, okay, to identify some obstacles that might be in the way of that. And it makes him a participant. If he says, so it's really a question of what can we do to get it to a 2, he begins coming up, or she begins coming up with some kind of remedy. And the remedy in those cases, those rare cases where people offer a 1, there's usually some kind of obstacle that the person has. It's less about his own kind of behavior. It's more about the circumstances and the situation in which there's an obstacle in the way of his doing that. So again, in your case, it could be that he doesn't like where his office is at the company. He wants to sit on a different floor. It could be that he has too much work to do, or the nature of his work, he's dealing with clients in other time zones, and he's up really late at night, and by the time the morning comes, he doesn't want to go into work. And so it's a way for people to essentially give them permission to talk about some of these obstacles.
Brilliant. Okay, maybe one final question, Daniel?
Sure.
Okay, so could you explain again the link between caveat vendetta and ABC in a nutshell?
Absolutely. Let's talk about caveat venditor, essentially seller beware. Okay? Here's the idea. Let's think about a world of buyer beware and a world of seller beware. Here's the transition. The old world was buyers have not much information, not many choices, and no way to talk back. That's a world of buyer beware. The new world is a world where buyers have lots of information, lots of choices, and all kinds of ways to talk back. Okay? So the difference between a world of that's fundamentally different. And you're right, I didn't do a good enough job of making this point. That is a fundamentally different world. A world of seller beware and a world of buyer beware are not different in degree. That is, seller beware is not slightly different from buyer beware. It's different in kind. It's a different enterprise altogether. And the reason we're in a world of seller beware is that the sellers can't take the low road. You will be found out. You have to take the high road. And so the connection between that and the ABCs is this. If you think about the social science tells us, if you go into the research, the social science tells us that in conditions of information equality, in conditions of parity between two parties, these are the personal qualities that seem to lead to the greatest effectiveness: attunement, buoyancy, and clarity. All right. The old ABCs the old ABCs of sales are always be closing. A always, B, C closing. Always be closing. This very aggressive, predatory style of doing things. That's actually not a bad approach when people don't have much information, don't have many choices, and no way to talk back. But that more aggressive, duplicitous, low-road approach simply isn't sustainable in a world where buyers have lots of information, lots of choices, and lots of ways to talk back. So if you look to the social science, what it tells us is that in those kinds of conditions, those more evenly matched conditions, what leads people to be effective are these three fundamental qualities. Attunement is perspective taking. Can I find common ground? Not can I bowl you over? Can I coerce you? Can I be very aggressive and push you into assent? But can I find common ground with you? That's attunement. Buoyancy. In a world of when everybody's in sales, you get rejected a lot. Buoyancy is how you stay afloat. And clarity, again, clarity goes directly to this change conditions. In a world of information asymmetry, your comparative advantage comes from your having access to the information and the other side not having that access. So access to information gives you that edge. But today, that just doesn't exist. Both sides have access to information. So the new skill isn't accessing the information, it's making sense of it. There's so much information out there right now that the key is to be able to curate that information, to distill that information, to make sense of that information. At the same time, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it's this move from problem solving to problem finding. If you have a client and they know precisely what their problem is, they say, oh, I need a better time management system. So let me go online and find the best time management system. They don't really need a coach. If they know my problem is time management and I got to go find online the best book or set of audio recordings or software for time management, they don't need a coach if that's their problem. They can find the solution on their own. But where a coach really comes in handy is when you come to them and say, I have a time management problem, and you say, you don't have a time management problem. What you have is an organizational problem. What you have is a management problem. What you have is a priority problem, where you're able to find a problem that they didn't realize that they have. So this move from information asymmetry to information parity, from buyer beware to seller beware, is what is the reason why attunement, buoyancy, and clarity are so important.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that, Daniel. Really did clarify that point and give us some awesomeness. So thank you so much for the presentation. It really was excellent, and the feedback is coming through from the people on the line.
Right.
However, what I would like to say is, please, can you post that feedback on Facebook? Because we'd love to see it on there, and also obviously sharing it on there. When you post it on there, your network gets to see and they get to learn about Daniel, and they'll go out there and learn all about it. But Daniel, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been great having you today, and the session was absolutely super. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the weekend. It's time for actually, some of you are still at the other side of the world, aren't you? So still got Friday to enjoy getting stuff done. But for me, I'm going to go and have some fun, meet up with some buddies, maybe hit some bars. And Daniel, have a fantastic weekend. Thank you so much once again.
Okay, Ben, thanks so much. It was fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, man. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.